My friends, as you know, our beloved Ukrainskaya Armia is losing more and more ground in Donbass. Casualties are increasing, and because of that, Ukraine is facing a growing number of
deserters.
That's right, entire units have decided to call it quits and go home.
Cowards! Our men flee the battlefield!
Due to all these desertions, the Ukrainian army is literally melting down in plain sight, faster than my dreams of becoming a pro athlete. At this point, it's a systemic issue that leads entire Ukrainian units to disintegrate before even reaching the front. This crisis was more or less concealed by the mainstream media up until recently when it was too big to hide. Here on the 29th of November, AP News reported, desertion threatens to starve Ukraine's forces at a crucial time in its war with Russia. Meanwhile, this is what Ukrainian news agency Union said. Entire units are fleeing. Shortly after, on December 1st, the Financial Times investigated this crisis and wrote, Ukraine struggles to recruit new soldiers as desertions rise.
We are winning!
Are we surprised though? When we know that the first mission of these Ukrainian conscripts that are forcefully mobilized looks like the game Green Light, Red Light from Squid Game. Meanwhile, we also learned that the sheer volume of desertions make it impossible for law enforcement to control. Honestly, what a disaster. To make up for the loss, Ukraine had a creative and brilliant idea. That's right, draft another 160,000 men between November and February. 40,000 people mobilized per month. And we all know how this will end. More desertions. So in this video, we will try to understand the scale of this phenomenon, try to explain why it is happening, and explore the possible solutions laid out by the armed forces of Ukraine. Spoilers, one of the brilliant ideas of the genius bar leading the Ukrainian army was the decriminalization of desertion. Can you guess what happened next?
Madness. Madness and stupidity.
Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukraine war. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my videos have been targeted with limited or no ads, so make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. According to Ukrainian law, there are two types of desertion. You have Article 4 or 7, unauthorized abandonment of a unit, or самовільне залишення частини in Ukrainian, marked by this acronym you can see on screen. Americans would say AWOL, absent without official leave, but without intent to desert. Essentially soldiers that run away and abandon their combat positions during a battle, for example. For Article 4.7, a Ukrainian soldier can face up to 10 years in prison. And then you have Article 4.8, desertion, to leave a unit with the intention of never returning to service. For this crime, a Ukrainian soldier can face up to 12 years in prison. I know there's a big gray area in between Article 4.7 and Article 4.8, but you know, it's the beauty of bureaucracy. So how many Ukrainian deserters are we even talking about? Obviously, it's difficult to estimate the exact number. But let's start with the lowest estimates. Officially, Ukrainian prosecutors opened 60,000 cases of desertion between January and October 2024. 40,000 of these cases were for unauthorized abandonment, and about 20,000 for actual desertion. That way they can claim that officially there are only 20,000 deserters.
A great success!
However, to what extent can we even trust these official figures? According to certain sources, the AFU had to deal with 9,500 cases of desertion in October alone. But then came the worrying numbers for November. According to rumors, an extra 19,000 new criminal proceedings were registered under Articles 407 and 408. Let's have a look at this Facebook post by Andriy Pisarenko, a commander of a mortar battery of the infamous Da Vinci Wolves Battalion. He said that the problem is how these cases are only the ones where officers submitted reports for. But many commanders never actually send these reports on their fighters who have gone AWOL to their superiors in the hierarchy. more often than not because commanders are afraid of punishment, since the status of their personnel is their responsibility. According to anecdotal evidence, one Ukrainian soldier said there were 6 criminal proceedings for desertion in his unit, while 27 cases have not been entered yet in the database, and that will probably just be shoved under the rug. So according to this example, the actual rate of desertion would be 5 times higher than the one officially announced. If we go back to April 2024, Arestovich, the former advisor to President Zelensky, already spoke of 100,000 deserters.
Кто-то пробовал говорить всерьез со 100 тысячами уклонистов.
Most of which were not even mobilized personnel dragged from the streets and stuffed into vans, but actual combat veterans, many of whom had volunteered and fought since 2022. A couple days later, on the 26th of April, Ukrainian lawyer Rostislav Kraviets also mentioned over 100,000 deserters. This was in spring 2024, but since then the situation at the front deteriorated quickly. You can imagine the scale of this desertion crisis by now. How many more Ukrainian soldiers may have deserted between summer, fall, and winter of 2024? In December, Union wrote that according to some reports, the real number of deserters may have reached 200,000 people.
Hasta la vista, baby.
You heard that right, 200,000 deserters. More than the combined Polish, German, Dutch, and British ground forces. All I can say is that wow, that NATO training really paid off. Actually, now that I remember, it was also mentioned that a number of Ukrainian soldiers used the opportunity of being trained abroad to desert and escape into the wilderness. Now, the problem is that due to all these desertions, the rate of mobilization in Ukraine was only enough to hit 2/3 of what the AFU needs to stay afloat. That's why Ukraine increased the rate of mobilized personnel from 30,000 per month to 40,000 per month. Because on top of the war of attrition, the general staff of the AFU is now even taking into account the growing number of desertions, whose gaps have to be filled up with replacements. I don't want to jab Ukraine, but in comparison, Russia only opened 10,000 cases for desertion. Let's just say that the Russians are more strict on that matter. The biggest disaster for Ukraine is not only having to deal with desertion, but also with what Ukrainians call shabuning. This is when a soldier is formally counted in a platoon, company, or battalion, but bribes his commanding officer to be stationed somewhere at the rear or just stay at home, where he can work a 9-to-5 job. Yes, that's right, the exact same thing that I told you about the Syrian army. I read this report about a Ukrainian rifle platoon of 30 men, where only 12 soldiers were really there in the trenches. The others were assigned to what they call the Kiev Restaurants Brigade. In the end, these guys have their military papers in order, so they cannot be bothered by the TCC agents, all the while cashing their army pay and working some side job, instead of bearing the burden of military service. Now let's explore the 5 main reasons that lead to such high desertion rates among the ranks of the Ukrainian army. Reason number 1 is because Ukraine is losing the war. I know it's harsh, but that's the reality. I mean, just look at the situation at the front. Who's making more gains? As you can see on this graph, it's not a surprise how the number of cases of desertions drastically increased between 2022 and 2024. And we all know that, historically speaking, it's always the army that is losing that suffers the most from desertion. The second reason, which is often mentioned in the mainstream media, is battle fatigue and the lack of rotations, which naturally leads to a significant drop in the morale of the troops. You all remember how on the 21st of September 2024, a Ukrainian soldier named Serhiy Gnezdilov, attached to the 56th Motorized Brigade, made a video to publicly announce that he was voluntarily leaving the unit. He called it voluntary demobilization. Same story for Kirill Babi, lieutenant in the 43rd Ukrainian Artillery Brigade. Like many men, he volunteered in February 2022. But already by November 2023, on Instagram he wrote, "I don't want to spend 3 more years in the war. I'm exhausted." On the 27th of February 2024, marking the 2nd anniversary of the war, Lieutenant Babi deserted and never returned. About this issue of battle fatigue, one battalion commander told AP, "At this stage, I do not condemn any of the soldiers from my battalion that deserted. because everyone is just really tired. Reality is the men that composed this patriotic army of the volunteers from 2022, well, they're tired, they're exhausted, they can't take it anymore, especially since they see no way out.
Hey, Don. I can't take anymore, okay?
And the problem is that there are barely any rotations for the grunts sitting in the trenches week after week, month after month, year after year. Even worse, leaves are often cancelled by commanding officers because there's always another Russian attack to counter, and all military personnel is needed at the front. There's another reason why leaves are constantly cancelled, but more on that later. In the end, some units stay on the line forever. We all remember the men of the 110th Mechanized Brigade that held the Avdiivka sector from March 2022 all the way until the first weeks of 2024. Or what about the 72nd Mechanized Brigade that defended Vuhledar from August 2022 until the fall of the city in October 2024? It's not a surprise that because of this factor, 20% of the soldiers of the 72nd Brigade marked as missing had in reality gone AWOL or outright deserted. In this article, Ukrainska Pravda talked about yet another combat unit facing the same problem. The guys worked on the front from October 2022 to June 2024. They were in positions for 20 months participating in battles. Now they're worn out, exhausted, psychologically traumatized. Eventually, the general staff woke up and allowed these men 4 weeks for rest and recovery at the rear.
No.
Instead of normal recovery, they were put together into a BTG and sent to the Kursk region. Because of that, many fighters simply said goodbye and went home. Do you understand? This is not RT reporting this story, but Ukrainska Pravda. In his Facebook post, Andrei Pisarenko said, "How can you call deserter a soldier that has been fighting since 2014, but that refused to take back some useless position in the no man's land? How can you call deserter a young man that volunteered in February 2022, but that has since then been wounded multiple times, and that refused to take part in a senseless frontal assault without any armored support?" I have to go back to this interview by Colonel Vahramiev of the 1st Presidential Operational Brigade. He admitted to Pravda, "We've been standing here for a year. No one is going home. It's hard to plan any maneuver with tired people. They need a break. I believe that after 6 months of active fighting, we should leave for at least 3 months. But to achieve this exact thing, the only way for Ukraine to grow their army is by TCC agents snatching people off the streets and shoving them into buses going towards training camps. The third reason for this mass desertion is due to poor training. Nowadays, most replacements came into the army as part of Zelensky's busification program. In other words, through mobilization. Every month, 20 to 30,000 men are drafted across Ukraine, although the number now is closer to 40,000 men. We covered it many times. Training is too short. If a recruit gets 1 month of training, he's very lucky. And overall, the training program is just inadequate. Soldiers are only taught the basics of how to handle an AK. Instead of gradually acclimating these mobilized troops to the reality of war, they're often sent right into some of the hottest parts of the front, right into the furnace. The shock is so intense that after their first taste of battle, many Mobics are just looking for ways to avoid being sent to the front again. To the extent where a lot of guys now see mobilization as a death sentence. And they're not completely wrong, because it is estimated that 50 to 70% of new infantry troops are KIA or wounded within days of starting their first rotation. To me, it's just a wasteful and almost criminal use of human resources. And it gets worse. With such rates of attrition, it also doesn't help that Ukrainian commanders regularly pull cooks, air defense specialists, even medics right into depleted rifle companies. And when the press interviewed some Ukrainian commanders about this, you know what they replied? "Yeah, well, sometimes we have no choice." That's how an artillery crewman was assigned to an infantry unit by his CO for a month, after discovering that his new position as a rifleman was made permanent without his knowledge. What do you think happened next? The artilleryman deserted. I also read reports stating that hundreds of mobilized personnel flee from training camps.
Screw you guys! I'm going home.
Let's pause a second and think of the effects this has on the troops. Imagine you're in a rifle squad, and week after week you have more soldiers deserting, one after the other. You would ask yourself, why am I sitting in this trench risking my life when all the others are at home? Okay, so all this was on the individual level, but the lack of encadrement or command structure sometimes leads entire units to abandon their brand new fortifications and just run away from the battlefield. And as you know, desertions cause this chain reaction of panic. If I remember correctly, in April 2024, it's the massive desertion of the entire 115th Mechanized Brigade that led to the Russian breakthrough in Ocheretine. In September, one battalion commander told CNN how his flank was left exposed after soldiers from neighboring units abandoned their positions without reporting it. There's also the story of the 123rd Territorial Defense Brigade near Vuhledar. First, it was the 186th Battalion that broke rank, and the next day was the infantrymen of the 187th Battalion that abandoned their combat positions, forcing the 72nd Brigade to abandon Vuhledar in a hurry. These territorial defense guys explained how the general staff didn't even provide their units with PKMs or machine guns to hold their trenches. This battalion of the territorial defense was only composed of 100 men, 20% of the actual strength of this unit. After this incident, the 100 soldiers of the 187th Territorial Defense Battalion simply returned to their home region of Mykolaiv and even staged a protest to complain about the unrealistic expectations of the general staff. We can also mention the complete disintegration of the newly formed 155th Mechanized Brigade due to 1,700 cases of desertion before even reaching the front. But I think that deserves its own analysis. Reason number 4 is that a lot of Ukrainian soldiers feel a great sense of injustice when it comes to their situation. On social media, they see how everyone is living normally at the rear. Some of them are living their best life as if there wasn't even a war going on. One Ukrainian soldier exceptionally managed to get a leave, and this is what he experienced upon his arrival in Kyiv. I drive past bars, cafes, restaurants, they're all packed. What the blyat are we dying at the front for? While everyone else is sitting in pubs. Not gonna lie, I would be pissed as well. Many soldiers don't understand the big gap between normal life of civilians in Kyiv and their sacrifice on the battlefield. Actually, Gnezdilov, the deserter of the 56th Motorized Brigade, explained how one of the main reasons he left was because he was also fed up with the corruption that allows a person to avoid being drafted in exchange for a certain amount of cash. Ukrainian soldiers are not blind. They can clearly see the thousands of Ukrainian men that are not mobilized, often part of the wealthier part of Ukrainian society, while at the same time factory workers don't have the same privileges, as they never made nearly enough money to be able to bribe government officials and get their ticket out of the draft. But to the eyes of the Ukrainian general staff, even a man who has nothing can still offer his life.
Pity the gods, man.
So in the end, how can impoverished and bussified military personnel get out of this hell? Desertion. The final reason behind Ukraine's high desertion rates is simply because of the lack of organization or a lack of understanding of the basic fundamentals of a large military structure. You see, after sustaining a combat injury, soldiers are allowed a medical leave. Typically, they're sent to hospitals in Dnipro or Kyiv to get surgery or to get treated. By the time they have recovered, many soldiers don't feel like returning to the front. Once they step out of the hospital, they simply go home. Same thing for soldiers on leave. They're losing track of permissioners, guys on leaves, losing track of deserters, losing track of wounded soldiers that recovered, losing track of the actual strength of rifle companies. Yet the SBU won't lose track of any dissenting journalist. At the same time, as a Ukrainian commander, it's really a catch-22 type of situation. If you don't grant leaves, your men will be exhausted and will eventually desert. If you do grant leaves for rest and recovery, you have a 50-50 chance that they never return to the unit.
Fuck.
Another problem that is often mentioned by deserters is the complicated system to transfer units. You see, a lot of Ukrainian commanders still have this Soviet mentality where they see their troops just like a resource. Soldiers are often beaten up. The Ukrainian army system remains outdated, and transferring from one combat unit to another still requires permission from the same commander soldiers are trying to get away from. Surprise, surprise, a transfer which is often denied. In the end, when you're stuck with donkeys leading your formation, the only way to quickly change units is through desertion. Ukraine also seems to lack the political will to truly go after all these deserters. By doing so, they have to open cases, and the true scale of the crisis would be open to the public. In contrast, one Ukrainian commander said that the Russian army has much stricter military discipline and much harsher punishments for desertion as well. Actually, the Russian military has entire military police battalions tracking down these deserters. And let's just say 20 years in prison is the best case scenario they can expect.
And we shoot deserters.
Meanwhile, there's less fear among Ukrainian soldiers of the consequences of abandoning their combat posts. Anyway, everyone says that there's so many deserters at this point that authorities are simply powerless. One of the main reasons behind this could be that in 2019, Ukraine completed the dissolution of military courts, transferring their functions to civilian judicial institutions. But as you can see, in times of crisis, it's not really working out. Now, what kind of solutions did the Ukrainian armed forces think about to solve this crisis? From what soldiers serving in the AFU told me, the more drastic change would be to reinstate military tribunals, followed by the creation of NKVD type of military police detachments just like the Russians, whose job would be to catch deserters. Alternatively, these detachments would be posted behind the front line to prevent entire units from fleeing. The soldiers said that this should be combined with a severe crackdown on corruption, which is the root of all evil in Ukraine. But for now, Ukraine preferred the soft approach. First idea in spring by increasing payments. The Kyiv Independent wrote, personnel serving at the zero line will get the additional financial reward together with a monthly salary of 20 to 25,000 hryvnias, or 500 to 600 USD, plus combat payments of 100,000 hryvnias, or $2,500. Then again in July, Ukraine introduces new incentives for military personnel, with active servicemen eligible for additional remuneration of 100,000 hryvnias. But as you can see, this didn't work. Then in November came the idea of decriminalization of desertion. Military personnel that deserted have until January 1st, 2025 to re-enlist in order to avoid criminal charges. Apparently this brought some positive results. In the first week of December, some 3,000 servicemen returned to their units. Is it going to be enough though? Especially since military psychologist Andriy Kozinchuk claimed that with the decriminalization, even more soldiers use this opportunity to say hasta la vista. Then came US advisors. They suggested lowering the age of mobilization to 18 years old to replenish the ranks of the AFU, essentially until the last Ukrainian. Meanwhile, Ukrainian journalist ASEF urges Ukrainian authorities to consider a gradual demobilization. He believes it would be fair to release from service as many soldiers as are drafted into the army. That would mean for every 40,000 men that are mobilized, 40,000 are demobilized. In theory, within 10 months, you would have the entire AFU standing at the front be brought to the rear. The other objective would be to increase the number of volunteers using financial incentives and fixed-term contracts. Essentially, the Russian army recruitment model that I mentioned in this video. ASEF suggested 3 to 6 months tours of duty. Sounds great on paper, not sure it will work. Because for this to work, every man in Ukraine would have to spend at least one tour of duty at the front at some point. I mean, good luck with that. In the meantime, many units in Ukraine like Azov prefer to organize their own recruitment campaigns, as they only take in volunteers. They said they're even willing to enlist some of the former deserters. But many of the commanders of Azov are also understandably reluctant to the idea. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description below.